This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and it's close to the end of the school year, so I brought my friend Rob back on, the same one I did a video with at the beginning of the year, and we're going to talk about 2 ways to end the school year based on your needs. So you're going to want to tune in and listen to our conversation. Hopefully we can help you out. All right, AP exams are almost over. This year is a little bit different because we do have some administrations of electronic exams, which do happen next week. By the way, I would like to just point out that Coach Hall and I are going to do a cram session on May 25th, 2021 for the online exam. So if you want to tune in 7:30 Eastern Time to the Garden of English YouTube channel, we will be here. On top of that, you're going to notice that right underneath me, I've got my friend Rob Bowman here. He's back again for the end of the year. What a great way to do things, to bookend, time with Rob because he has awesome stuff. But before we let him talk and get into what he's doing, I'd like to just point over here and say thank you to the Patreon supporters to the Garden of English. We are greatly indebted to the support that you give us, and that's why we are able to make as many films as we can and actually invite people like Rob on here and pay him the millions that we do to get here. Right, Rob?
Oh, wait, what?
Right. Anyway, if you're interested in supporting the Garden of English in that way and seeing the perks that come with that, you can check out the video that's right up here, and you can see some other ways you can help support the Garden of English as well. But thank you to them. And Rob, now let's actually get to you. Remind us a little bit about who you are. Not that we would ever forget, but remind us a little bit about you if this is the first time anybody's ever met you. And then let's get right into it. Like, tell us how we're going to end our school years strong with things that are engaging and fun and meaningful. So take it away. Rob, tell us about you and what we have here right to our screen.
Right, great, excellent. So yeah, I'm Rob Bowman. I teach AP Lang. I also teach AP Seminar. And currently I'm teaching grade level 11th grade, but I've taught all 4 levels of high school English, creative writing. I've taught them all. I've taught in Colorado, and I'm currently in Southern California teaching. And like all of you, I've had a really turbulent year. Yeah. We've been out of the classroom for an extraordinary amount of time. It's been hard to get kids to engage in a meaningful fashion. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I am dragging myself across the finish line here.
Oh, this year I am. Typically, I don't feel like I'm dragging, but this year I'm dragging. And I've even been in the classroom all year, but it's just been different, you know?
Yeah.
And
it's been tough.
Yeah. So, I think that for most people in the U.S., that either they're finishing up the school year like right now at the end of May, or they've got like 2 or 3 more weeks going into June. And it's like, hey, let's try to offer some suggestions, that are essentially antithetical in nature to what we did before, because we started with how should you start your year, 2 different ways. Well, now we've got 2 different ways to end the year, and so we've got your assignment up here to the right. What do we do? What are we thinking about?
The beginning of the year and the end of the year for me are kind of similar places. Yeah. I need to transition them into a new mode of thought. Yeah. And I need them to start thinking in new ways. Right now, I need them to transition into AP Lit kind of thinking, because for us, seniors will be taking AP Lit. I know that's not the case at every school.
Now, are you the Lit teacher at your school?
I'm not the Lit teacher at my school.
I just wondering.
Yeah, I'd like to teach it eventually, but our Lit teacher now is great, so he can continue doing it. It's kind of like, I'm sure people have noticed that an introduction and a conclusion on a paper are the same thing, but kind of reversed from one another, kind of flip-flop mirror version of one another. And this activity is going to achieve some of the same things we talked about at the beginning of the year with the Great Sentence Beauty Pageant tournament. This one is a translation exercise, which is going to help kids to think about syntax, think about diction, and think about how we convey meaning to a specific audience. But it's going to do it in a very different way, using poetry to get them ready for AP Lit.
Super cool. And you know what? As an AP Lit teacher, poetry is always where my kids jump in and struggle the most, because they kind of come in with this kind of defeated attitude. And when I think about, this assignment that you're going to tell us about that I actually think is really, really fun, I'm already like jazzed up, and I'm like, okay, I can't do it this year, but I can definitely get into that next year for sure.
Yeah, this is a good one. And it can happen at any point in the school year. When you need kind of a break, this is a good one to do. Yeah. It's designed to take 2 days. You could stretch it into 3. I would not do it in 1. I think it'd be hard to get it really successful in 1 day because of the time required for the bulk of the activity.
Right. Well, you know what? That actually works out really well, because the activity that I'm going to talk about right after is something that you're going to want to do over 2 to 3 weeks. So now, depending on how much time you have left in your school year, you've got 2 really good options. One that you can kind of make shorter, and one that you can elongate. The other thing too is that I assigned my assignment a little bit. That's a little superfluous, but anyway, I did assign it a little bit earlier this year than I normally do, and I was like, I'm gonna have 2 class periods left, and so now I'm like, oh man, I might bring this in this year, although I'm not sure I'll be able to, but we're gonna try.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I hope you do. I'll be eager to hear how it goes.
All right. So anyway, sorry for talking your ear off, right, and interrupting. Take it away.
So, it's the idea of the exercise is I give them a poem to translate into English, so that they can see how difficult it is to translate a poem. But there are some very interesting wrinkles here. Every student in class gets the same poem. And I tell them, this is a poem by the classical poet Tantalus, which is not a real poet that's ever existed. It's the name of a play, but it's not the name of a poem.
Right.
So I give them the poem Tantalus, but by the poet Tantalus, rather. And I take a poem by someone I like from antiquity. I like quite a few poets. This year, I think I might experiment with Basho. I think haiku might be fun to do with this exercise. Yeah. But I take the original poem, whether it's by Catullus or whoever else, and I take it from the original language or from an English translation, and I translate it into, say, Finnish using Google Translate. I translate it into Scandinavian. I translate it into Greek.
Now, do you recommend using a classical poet or a work from antiquity, or is it kind of like, do what you want, but this is what I normally do?
I usually do something from antiquity because the language structures are so different than what we're doing now, and it adds to the challenge for the students.
Gotcha. Okay.
But then I take the poem that I've translated into, say, Finnish, and I translate it from Finnish into Hawaiian. And then I transcribe from Hawaiian into the document, and that's the poem that they get. So they now have a poem that's quite a distance away from the original that they cannot Google search and find the answer for.
So you're saying you're going to just use Google Translate. I've got my poem in English that I have from antiquity, toss it into Translate, and then translate the translation through again so that we've got some removal here. Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
And then you leave it in Hawaiian or you leave it in Finnish or whatever, yeah?
Right. And I'll give them multiple examples. Just to make it fun, I'll say, this group gets it in Finnish, this group gets it in Hawaiian, this group gets it in Gaelic, whatever it is. So I'll do multiple steps translation and put up different versions, even though they're all the same poem.
Yeah.
Then students have to translate the poem into English. Now, you may think, oh, this is going to be easy. They're just going to translate it and no problem. They come back a disaster.
So you're saying when they drop it into Google Translate and it comes back in English, that's what they have to then work with in order to...
Yes.
Okay.
In order to make a beautiful poem. The goal is to create something beautiful. And we have we'll get to the grading in just a moment. So one of the things I tell them, and this would be hard in distance learning, but they could be on an honor system. I tell them to translate one word at a time, not to drop in the whole thing. Yeah. And I collect their rough translation to make sure they actually do it maybe a couple words or a line at a time as they translate it. Then they'll have this kind of gobbledygook of English in there, this kind of crazy mess.
Yeah.
And then they have to make it into something beautiful by finding what are synonyms that work here. What are they trying to say that they're not getting at? Maybe there's a metaphor here that doesn't work because it's based on something they don't understand.
Yeah.
And so they get a full class period to work on their translations with a partner. Now, in our distance learning, it's going to be harder to do with a partner, where you might have distancing guidelines in your classroom. They can certainly do this individually.
Right.
And then how we grade it is everyone gets an A for translating the thing.
Yeah.
It's incredibly hard to make these good.
Yeah.
But we have a poetry reading where the students read their translations, and I say to them, the most beautiful poem will get extra credit.
Nice.
And so on the last day, everyone's getting the same grade in the grade book on this thing. They all get an A on it. Yeah. Someone who really needs it gets the extra credit, and then I'm done with my grading for the year.
Yeah.
The skills this uses are incredibly high level. And then we can have a conversation with them about, okay, you remember when we read, Tolstoy, you remember when we read this or that. Think about how hard it was to translate that book versus these 6 lines of poetry we just did.
Right. And maybe there's a new appreciation for what goes into translation. Another thing about that too, right, is when kind of conceptualizing this, so the kid, has an original Finnish version, which is already 2 or 3 times removed from the original poem. And they start translating line by line, even just using Google Translator, and then trying to make sense of this. They have to then be creative to say, okay, I know this was supposed to say something that was meaningful and creative once, but now I have to do this on my own. And then they get to kind of pick and choose, though. Like I think about the idea of like really choosing your language from the image that's there. I don't understand this image, but I need to make it something cohesive.
Yeah.
How can I take this image and do so? And you're really getting into that's highly sophisticated type of stuff, as opposed to just, hey, let's go into Google Translate and let's watch it just do what it does.
Right, and it won't work. It really does force them into very different patterns of thought.
Yeah.
With all this, it really forces them to consider a lot of things. And how do I make this idea work? How do I make it function?
Yeah,
is a very difficult thing.
Now, at the end of this, do you actually show them the original poem that you worked with?
So here's how the idea for this assignment came about. And this will tell you a lot about me and what kind of young man I was. So in college, I read a poem that I thought was beautiful.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a little stilted in parts. It was an ancient Greek poem.
Yeah.
So no, it was ancient Roman. So I got my hands on the original Latin poem and then bought, because this is pre-internet, I bought a Latin dictionary and sat down and made my own translation for it to give to a girl that I had a crush on.
Gotcha.
And gave her this. And let me tell you, we did not end up dating, but the poem was great. It did not work out. It was a weird thing to do to someone.
Yeah.
Here's the poem I translated. But it was a good exercise for me as a writer.
Yeah.
And I still appreciate that part of it, but not as romantic as I thought it would be.
Right. And you know what? I think that too, and the idea of transitioning to AP Lit with this is so important, because in AP Lit a lot, I've got kids that are like, the punctuation, like honestly, every punctuation mark is so thoughtful. And I'm like, not just every punctuation mark, every word is put there purposefully on the page. And they're like, I'm thinking about how much I can remediate that conversation when I can just refer back to, hey, remember at the end of last year when I had you translate and you were like, you and I were having a conversation earlier where you were talking about the difference between saying automobile and car, right? And it's like, remember when you had to make that choice between automobile and car in order to have your translated poem make sense? Like, hey, that's what we're talking about here. But once again, do you actually show the kids the English version of the poem, or the one that?
So I do eventually. So the poem I use is actually the poem that I translated when I was in college.
Oh, gotcha.
Which I still have memorized. I know it by heart.
Yeah.
And I can recite my translation of it.
Ha! Even better.
And so then we'll have a conversation of, well, which ones, do we prefer? And I try not to say which one's better, because I don't want to demean the work they've done.
Right.
And there's no right answer to this. That's one of the things I love in English that makes all my math-friendly students crazy is there's no right answer here. There's better and there's worse, but there's no, right answer.
Right.
So it's, what do we prefer in this moment? What does it achieve that's different? And those are, very intellectually rigorous conversations.
For sure.
We're talking about the difference between connotation and denotation with our words. What are the implications? Another example I love to give kids is, what's the texture of the word? How's it feel? Because I can say someone's pretty, and I can say someone's pulchritudinous.
Yeah.
And pulchritudinous sounds like a disease.
Right.
But it's wildly flattering, even though it sounds like I'm chewing on a squirrel's bones.
Right.
So, how's that work? How do we make the words sound good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, so that's great. I think this is a super fun activity, and I'm thinking about like, all right, what poem am I going to use to do this with my kids if I have that extra time this year, because I think that it will be fun for that. And just so everybody knows, we have the directions for this right here to our right, and you'll see that my mouse is covering it right here. This will be linked up down below. So this is Rob's directions for this. But please note that if you look in here, you don't actually put the poem itself in here. And basically when you talk to other teachers, it's like, hey, you're your own teacher. Choose your own poem and off you go, right? Now, what is the poem, once again, that you do use for this typically?
Oh, man, I don't even want to say.
All right, don't say.
I don't want students to find it. It's a classical poem. I'll put it that way.
That's true.
I will encourage you, find shorter poems for this.
Yeah.
It is going to take way more time than you think it will.
Yeah.
You don't want to have them doing a, giant T.S. Eliot, whatever. He wrote in English. But although that would be interesting, actually, to use a poem originally written in English. And that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So
no proofread here or anything like that. Yeah, of course.
No, you don't want, you don't need a lot here.
Yeah.
5-6 lines is going to be plenty. And if you want to do an even quicker version, do a 3-line haiku and see how it goes. Because it will still be a very challenging exercise.
Yeah, no, this is super fun, and I think it really helps bring out the idea of, picking the words that you like and trying them on for size and saying, yep, this is the one that I like, and we go from there. Yeah, so that's super awesome, right, Rob? I appreciate you sharing that with us. I'm going to shift over to mine now, right? And feel free to interject and tell me the things you hate about it or love about it, and then we'll go from there. But once again, mine is for those of you that have a little bit more time. You're like, I need to fill 2 weeks or 3 weeks, right? And mine does not actually transition to AP Lit like Rob's does. Mine is, how do we kind of get a culminating activity for AP Lang? And I think that's what's really good about you coming on here, Rob, is that I think that we're really hitting all of the needs that we have. Are we trying to get a culmination, or are we trying to kind of transition? Are we trying to fill up a short amount of time, or are we trying to fill up a longer amount of time? And we've got all the options here for you, and that's once again why I called Rob, because I was like, he nailed it at the beginning of the year. I'm sure he'll nail it at the end of the year too. So this is awesome. So you could actually find mine on the website, thegardenofenglish.com. And then you can just scroll down. You want to click on where it says Files and Resources, and then it will say Final Projects. And I've got Final Projects for Lit, which are board games, and Final Projects for Lang, which is a propaganda project. So why don't I bring up this propaganda project here, and that will be linked up down below, but it's also on thegardenofenglish.com. And so here's my propaganda project. You can see it to the right here. And these are all of the directions here that I'm not going to read for you. But basically what I do is this, right? I'll summarize what's going on here, and then I'll show some examples. What I have my kids do is I have my kids take any polemic issue or polarizing issue that they want to talk about, and I will let them do anything. Like typically when kids, write argument papers, I'm like, no, you can't talk about abortion. No, you can't talk about gun rights. You can't talk about these things that they're just going to regurgitate somebody else's argument. I do make them, I'm like, if you want to talk about like gun use, like talk about how your local town is regulating deer tags during the hunting season and you hate it. You know what I mean? Like I want them to kind of bring in like nuanced approaches to these kind of bigger things that they really want to talk about. But I want to talk about hunting. Well, then good. You're talking about deer tags. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But for this project, I don't do that. I'm like, you know what? You want to talk about legalizing marijuana? Talk about legalizing marijuana. You want to talk about why Monsanto is the devil? Well, then fine. You talk about why Monsanto is the devil. Anything you want. You want to talk about politics? Talk about politics. Because one of the things that I don't normally do in my classroom is I don't make my classroom highly political. And the reason why is because I don't care where kids show up on the spectrum. I just want them to be critical thinkers. And if they're critical thinkers, there are plenty of smart Democrats, there are plenty of smart Republicans, there are plenty of smart independents. We're good. You know what I mean? So because of that, I'm like, this is the time when you get to pick that polarizing moment. And what's always interesting is that the kids like to jump on those really polarizing elements that they have really strong feelings for that I've been hearing about all year. Because although I'm not running a political classroom per se, they still get, they still talk about it amongst themselves. There are some arguments bring up, great political points and whatnot. And what's nice is I always put that in the catalog of my mind. And when the kids come up with their group and they're like, we're going to do legalizing marijuana. And let's say I know that there's a student who's vehemently opposed to such. I'm like, I will let your group do that as long as you make the propaganda flyer for why we should legalize marijuana. And then they're like, no! I had a kid last year who's like the Republicans' Republican, right? And I told him, I said, he's like, we're going to do politics. And I'm like, no problem. But you are going to make your flyer about why it is best to vote Democrat. And he was like, I would love to. And let me tell you, he nailed it. And he was like, I can't wait. And what's really cool about it is that the kids, when I tell them, this is going to happen, and they still choose their parts. They choose their parts to do it. And I'm like, this is important, folks, because if you disagree with people, you want to figure out what they actually believe before you just pigeonhole them into corners, because that's what you see in contemporary media, and that's not going to cut it. You're not going to have a good conversation unless you actually know what the other side really believes as opposed to what people say about them. And because of that, I use this to kind of open up the civics of my course, especially at the end of the year. So anyway, they choose their polemic piece. They each have to pick a side. So it's going to be one of those things where they have to research valid sources that are going to support either side. And then they're going to create a flyer. And I tell them, hey, your flyer has to have one eye-catching visual. It has to contextualize the urgency on the flyer. It needs to actually reference source information. But one thing that I make them do is I actually make them misquote a source for the other side to make it seem like it's on your side. And now that's incredibly unethical. You and I know that.
Sure.
And then they're like, wait a second, so you want us to misrepresent the other side? And I'm like, you bet. And I'm like, the reason why is because when you fall for something that's propagated, most of the time, that's what they do. And I'm like, here's your chance to be unethical with your synthesis and know it and know why you're doing it so that you know what you're looking for later on. Because a lot of times, once you've experienced something, you know what it looks like the next time it shows up, right?
Yeah.
And all year before the exam, I will never let them misquote sources because that is unethical. But
Yes.
in the news, it happens all the time. You take your soundbite, you take it out of context, and now, someone sounds like, the most amazing person on the planet or the most devilish person on the planet because something's taken out of context. So I do tell them you're allowed to do that. What are you thinking about? You thinking about something?
Do you offer AP seminar at your school?
We do not. No.
Because this is a very AP seminar-ish kind of mindset and activity, which is great.
Right. So now, that's for those of you that teach AP seminar, this could probably potentially work for you as well. For me, the reason why I do it is because they have to create their own flyer, which is an argument, and they have to synthesize sources into their argument while mixing in their own picture for the background and whatnot. So you can see I'm getting my argument and synthesis in here. And then the next thing that they do is they have to create a rhetorical analysis of their partner's flyer. So once they create their own flyer, they trade with their partner. And for me, when it comes to group work, Rob, when I was in college, I cared about my 4.0. I was always put in the group with the kids that were like, C's get degrees, And it was just like, oh man. So I'd always have the weight fall on me to make sure that things were perfect. And, as I strove for perfection, but in my classroom, whenever I do group projects, I always have a group grade and an individual grade. And the group grade is always worth no more than 20% of the final grade. So that means that a kid can get, if the group does nothing, the kid who does everything will still get an 80. And if the group does half of what they're supposed to, the kid can still get a 90. And at that point, I think that that's pretty fair. So you couldn't establish social rules that people would want to adhere to. I am going to take a couple points off for that. But I'm not going to sabotage your grade because of it, and I'm not going to make you do more work because of it. So anyway, they trade their flyers, they do a rhetorical analysis, and then what they have to do is their two group grades are for this. They get a group grade for their works cited. So I make them create a works cited for the sources that are on their flyers. And I'm like, here's OWL, and here's the template for works cited, off you go. But if they don't do it right, they will get 0 out of those 20 points. It's an all or nothing grade. And they're like, what? Like, how can you say that? And I'm like, because you have to learn to do your research to make sure you're doing it right. And there are tons of avenues on YouTube and OWL to know that you're getting it done right. We do also run a junior research paper that every junior has to do. So they've already seen all this stuff anyway. So I'm like, you've already done it. You've already done it a million times. You got to make sure it's right. And then the last part of the group grade is to present it how I want it to. And that's with a cover page with a picture, flyer 1, flyer 2, rhetorical analyses, and the works cited. So I'm going to actually scroll down here, Rob, and I know that you're looking at a different screen than I am, but I'm going to look at the example here. So this was done by two students of mine, or two of the best that I've ever had, which is interesting because if you read their rhetorical analyses, they're not really that awesome, which is weird because all year they were cranking it except for this. Maybe they were just like, okay, we're spent. I don't know. But they're done decently fine. But the real benefit to what we have here is their project. So they wanted to talk about SeaWorld because this is when, what was that Netflix documentary?
Blackfish?
That's it. That's when that's when Blackfish came out. And so they took SeaWorld's animal care. They put their visual on the front. They put their names here. Okay. And then this was the first flyer that the kids one of the students did. So Bridget did this one. And when I saw it, I was just like, wow, what a cool flyer. I tell the kids, like, these should be good enough for me to want to pin them up in the front of the post office on the pin boards that they always have, like where you put your card and whatever. I'm like, I should be able to put your flyer up there, and people should be like, wow, no kidding, And so sure enough, if you look at this visual here, I mean, this just came out great. And I think that this student used Photoshop. So she could Photoshop. But, I mean, nowadays we've got Canva, which is typically free and very easy to use. And a lot of kids know how to use Photoshop and a lot of those other free kind of elements there. If I were to have a student ask me to make a video, I would tell them as long as the production quality is pretty solid, I'd let them do it. Yeah.
Mhm.
But anyway, the next one is, so this of course has the call to action, put an end to the madness, shut down SeaWorld, right? Because they're abusive to their orcas. But notice that the next one down, this student took a picture of Captain America and turned it
Yeah.
into, I mean, look at this. This is just
I'm really,
amazing.
I'm really into this poster.
Yeah,
Great.
like I look at this and I'm like, wow, SeaWorld, like rescues, support SeaWorld, support sea life. I'm like, wow, this becomes a conservation like extravaganza. And this is exactly what I'm looking for. And, they both misquote a source to make it seem like it's actually on their side when it's not. And so they're practicing with that, but then they actually have done research for real sources. And, the thing is although I require my kids to do the unethical synthesis, it's because I have an entire unit in my synthesis during the school year where I talk about how that's not okay. If you're the type of person that's like, I would never want to encourage my kids for that because it doesn't fit contextually into your school year, good, then don't do it, right? Rob, I mean, you've got your directions that we've got in the description down below. We're going to make it so that people can make a copy and then edit that, right? For mine.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Folks,
I mean,
edit
we
it.
should always be adapting to what suits not just our practices, but our population of students as well.
Right.
There's going to be very different contextual things depending where and what you're teaching and all the rest. My materials from 2 years ago didn't work this year. I'll tell you that.
Yeah,
I'm
for
still
sure.
the same kid.
Right, same dude too, So It's one of those things where so you don't like part of what the assignment is, just change it. You're free to do so. That's not a problem. Anyway, so then you'll see that we have the rhetorical analyses here, a thesis, 2 to 3 body paragraphs. And then I don't make them write a conclusion. I don't make them write a full intro because it's just the final project that says, can you provide the rhetorical analysis? And then they have their work cited. And then after that, they're done. They're done for the year. They've totally demonstrated that they can contextualize and really do something. And typically they do try to pick something that they're passionate about. And what I really love, like I said, is that when I know how a particular kid feels about something and I make them do the opposite side, originally I'm typically met with a couple sighs. And then all of a sudden that by the end of it, they're like, oh my word, that was enriching. And I'm like, I know. That's the point, It's funny because like I teach theology as well. And I start my theology course every year, and I'm like, my favorite atheist philosopher is Sam Harris, right? And he's a neurosurgeon. And the kids are like, wait, what? And I'm like, of course. I'm like, you have to be ready and willing to recognize the intelligence of the other side, because that's why we have arguments. That's, you know what I mean? And then we can find, hey, here's where we disagree, and that's okay because that's what humans do. But we don't have to be jerks about it. You know what I mean? And
Sure.
Unfortunately, the media on both sides kind of pretends like we do. And it's like, I don't want that for my civics, for my kids. You know what I mean? That's not how I want to roll in my classroom. But anyway, final comments here, Rob, about the end of the school year or anything like that before I wrap things up.
Sure. One quick thing, just a piece of reading that is, I think, revelatory for writers and readers alike is the new George Saunders book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain.
I recently did, should I say in February or March, I did a web conference with Jay Heinrichs, right? So he and I were presenting on something, and sure enough, that's exactly what he pulled out, for sure.
This book is extraordinary. So the setup of it, I know Saunders primarily known as a short story writer. He's got one novel. He's a good reporter and essayist and all those things. This is an analysis of 7 Russian short stories from the 1800s, but each story is followed up or even interrupted by his notes and lectures he would give his own students about craft.
Yeah.
So it's a literary analysis, but it's also a composition book. How does language work? How does imagery work?
Yeah.
How do writers participate in their craft? If I was a far wealthier man than I am, I would just give copies to all my students.
Yeah.
But all the teachers who teach writing in any form should be reading this book as soon as possible.
Yep. So you're the second person to tell me that in the last 2 months, so I better get my hands on a copy of that over the summer. There's no doubt about it.
It's awesome.
Great.
Just terrific.
Super cool. So anyway, Rob, I want to give you a huge, thank you here, right? If anybody else found this video helpful, we're going to ask that you just click like and subscribe because it's the easiest way to help the Garden of English. There's no doubt about that. Please note, though, that we are indeed quite active on Facebook and Instagram, so you can check us out there. Rob, do you have any way to get are you on Twitter or anything like that?
I'm on Twitter at RBBWMN.
Okay.
So if you want to find me there, it's not really teaching stuff. It's more just me being a goofball, but you're more than welcome to check in with me
Right.
And I'd be happy to correspond there with anything you have questions about for lessons or whatever else.
Super cool, right? We have a bunch of resources at thegardenofenglish.com. Don't forget that these lessons will actually be, or these activities will be linked up right down below as well. And we are super grateful once again for our Patreon supporters, so consider checking that out as well. But anyway, Rob, I hope that you have the most awesome end of the school year that you can have. I hope your kids totally own it in a couple days when they take their digital exam. And I really appreciate you giving up your time to come out and talk with me again.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm so glad to be invited, and I hope everyone has an excellent end to this very challenging school year.
All right. You have a great day.